Hello, risk takers, awe makers, daredevils, and death defiers. I'm Grant Faulkner, and I'm actually none of those things. I like sitting a lot. I've become averse to sweating as I get older, more and more averse. I like taking short, gentle walks and pondering stories I'd like to write someday and binge watching TV. And I think my stories are as close as I get to being an awe maker these days, and that's only hope for awe. But I'm here with my co-host, Brooke Warner. And Brooke, I'm talking about risk-taking beyond the page because we have a risk-taker extraordinaire as a guest today in Caroline Paul. And Caroline is a surfer, a mountain climber, a pilot, just an all-around adventurer. She was a firefighter, and she just wrote the book, Why Fly, about her obsession with flying a gyrocopter as her marriage dissolved. And I know you've got at least a little daredevil in you because you swam to Alcatraz a few years back. And given that you might have swam in proximity to sharks and other sea creatures in what must have been very cold water, I'd say you're a risk taker. Do I have that right?
I can be. I'll put it that way. I'm by no means a daredevil. I think I'm a calculated risk taker. I do like big challenges. And so the Alcatraz swim certainly qualifies as a big challenge. I've skydived, I've climbed big mountains, I've done long distance races. So, I wouldn't say risky as much as pushing myself. And sometimes I push myself in ways that intersect, I guess, with feeling risky. And I'm sure this is familiar to anybody who's been a parent too, but I have gotten more risk averse since becoming a mom. I mean, it's been 15 years, but still, like these things used to be no brainers. And I think less so since James arrived on the scene. And I guess that's maybe natural that we might get a little bit more self protective. But I also know that there are people, for whom being a risk taker is in their DNA, people that we might call counterphobes. I am decidedly not that. I have a lot of phobias. And, probably the more uncertain the world gets, the more phobias I have. But how about you, Grant?
Well, I loved your list because everything you ticked off, I was like risk, 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 risk. And I think it's interesting because Caroline doesn't feel like many of the things she does are risky either. So I guess it's all perspective. I was definitely more so like you when I was younger and bolder and before I had kids. And I always thought I'd do things like parachute and scuba dive and hang glide, but as I got older, the calculation of risk reward certainly minimized my thirst for that type of risk. Perhaps because I wasn't really truly thirsty to begin with, or I would have done it when I was young. I wasn't the kid doing skateboard tricks, as you might imagine. And I think I like risks that somehow don't appear as risks to me. Like I like to get lost in a city or a new place and go into new unknown, neighborhoods to take photos, or I go into dive bars without thinking a whole lot about it because I grew up with dive bars and some rough characters in my life. So, I've just never been afraid of them. But there have been the occasional moment when, I've entered one and the whole place has stared at me as I walked in the door. I was like, what's that guy doing here? And I remember once I was taking photos in a neighborhood when this man came storming out of his house to confront me, and he definitely was an unsavory character. But back to Caroline Paulbrook, I want to talk about something she writes early in Why Fly. She says she became obsessed with flying a gyrocopter, this tiny, strange looking experimental aircraft, right at the moment her marriage was dissolving. And she's very clear eyed about why. She says essentially, we reach for control in difficult times. And what better thing to control than a machine that lifts you above your troubles? And I think most of us have done a version of that, perhaps not, obviously not the gyrocopter part, but the reaching. And the moment when something important is slipping away and you grab for something that you can manage. And I think that I might have my own version of that and what I call my workaholism, although I don't think that's quite the right word for it. But I'm just kind of addicted to creative projects, I think. And they give me the feeling of being up in the sky, you might say. And my work gives me a peace because I can focus on it intensely and I can put something into the world and create a different conversation. And there's just something about putting creations into the world, especially with other people, that just makes me very happy and gives me some of the things that I think flying gave Caroline. And I'm guessing, whatever, there might be a wound in there somewhere because I've been like this for a long time. I've always kind of been a workaholic. I detasseled corn for 6 years as a teen, and I worked at this grocery store stocking shelves before school every morning. And yeah, and I even just used to love the extremes and the type of masochism that was involved in long distance running. So I guess that's my version of flying, right? Flying a gyrocopter, kind of just pushing different kinds of limits. And that's the way I feel most myself. And I do think that like why we fly and why we push limits, begs a lot of questions about what it means to be human. And that's why I liked Caroline's book so much. So, can I ask you if your swim or other activities, perhaps your own, we both kind of said we're workaholics, although I don't know if that's the right word. But if it has an emotional component like this, if you've had your own version of the gyrocopter.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I do think we have both disclosed in previous episodes, that we both feel like we're workaholics, and I like that you just like casually were like, well, there's probably a wound in there somewhere, but let's move on.
Yeah, exactly. Things to do. I got things on my list,
Right,
man.
exactly.
Coffee to drink.
There you go. Get it. It's interesting to contemplate though, because like where work is concerned, I know I do it for the passion. Obviously, at least in part, but I think we're so validated in this culture for striving, for working hard. I come from two parents who worked a lot and who worked long hours. And so it was modeled for me. I've run my own business for a really long time. And so baked into that is this notion that, the day starts early and it never really not working. And so I've never thought of it for myself as masochistic per se. I do have a dear friend who refers to her workaholism that way. And she says she's sort of punishing herself with the long hours and enjoying it. I don't feel like I'm punishing myself, although I do feel like I sometimes enjoy the long hours and that I'm sort of like proud of my stamina. So maybe there is something in there to examine a little bit more. Like I get tired, I get overwhelmed. I don't have a gyrocopter though to turn to, and I feel like maybe I need one. I mean, maybe that is the reason for taking on these kind of extreme challenges. Is just to say, well, it's going to take me away from this, kind of built-in thing that we're set up to do every day.
I appreciate that you defined workaholism around passions, because that's really what it is for me. It's generally not a destructive thing. I think it's more a consuming thing because I don't think of my work as punishing, when you mentioned your friend.
Right.
In fact, quite the opposite. I find it very enlivening. And I think Caroline would say the same thing about her gyrocopter. She's not like seeking death or anything. She's not that type of risk taker. And one thing I found interesting about the memoir was how, she took her somewhat individual and this very particular obsession with flying and made someone like me relate to it, Brooke. And I've heard you often say that memoirs need to speak to the universal. And I think Caroline's memoir is a great example of that. Her book resonates for non-pilots and couch specialists like me, who Caroline says she wrote it for. It's not really about flight. It's about the human need to find something to hold on to when the ground shifts beneath you. And there's certainly, there's something paradoxical about that. Because flight, by definition, you're giving up the ground. You're not holding on to anything. You're surrendering to the air. And that's exactly the paradox she's working with. The thing that feels like control, mastering an aircraft or learning the physics and running the pre-flight checklist as she does, it's a kind of surrender. You're submitting yourself to forces larger than you, like gravity and wind and weather. And she draws this parallel to love also, which also feels like it should be something you can manage. But then it turns out to be governed by all these forces you can't predict or contain. And I've personally been thinking about this because I've been, embarking on this new revision of my novel, The Letters. And the novel was based on Roland Barthes' A Lover's Discourse. And that book, he actually wrote it because he'd written a lot of letters to a person who had rejected him, a person he loved. And so I kind of flipped it. I took the book's inspiration and turned it back into letters. And Barth has this line about how love is not a wound you recover from. It's a wound you carry forward. And that's kind of at the center of my book. And he writes that to be in love is to be in a state of permanent risk, which I thought was really interesting too. So it is an adventure, and I think that's what Caroline is circling around. Both flight and love require you to accept that you might crash. It's kind of a crazy endeavor in a way. But you do it anyway. And the question the book asks, why fly? It's also asking, what is it that keeps us, choosing these things that could destroy us?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing to contemplate for sure. And I'm going to add another layer to this, or perhaps it's a counterpoint going back to counterphobics, because counterphobics are sometimes known as adventure seekers, and oftentimes that adventure seeking, as we were joking, but it's true. It's like it's an avoidant behavior. Like it's easier to jump out of a plane than to have a hard conversation. And I'm sure that Caroline would agree with that sentiment, although she's certainly not romanticizing it. She says at one point that she was losing something valuable. So she did what many do, which is try to gain control elsewhere. And certainly we see this as a common human behavior, Grant. I mean, I think that there's something worth saying here too about women in risk specifically, because it's another thread that runs through all of her work, The Gutsy Girl, Tough Broads, and this new book. And she's been making an argument for years that women are socialized away from physical risk, that women and girls are taught that our bodies are fragile, that danger is not our domain. And this costs us something, which is the knowledge of our own capability and capacity. So I love that about what she's doing here, because I've always been, very athletic and, certainly very aligned with strong girls and athletic girls. And so I think there's something so important about that message. And then, of course, Mary Oliver has this very famous line we've all heard 100 times: tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And I think Caroline is asking what happens when women answer that question for themselves. And I really love that. And, certainly sometimes I do ponder it because it comes up, and I'm sure you do too.
I don't think that question can be asked enough, actually. It's funny, the internet recycles these things so much they
Hmm.
become cliches in a way, but it's a good question to ask yourself every day. And I think about adventure and how it's usually framed as this kind of bold action, but I think there are different ways to think about it. And Caroline portrays all sorts of adventurous women in her book, Tough Broad, and one of those adventures even happens to be a bird watcher. And I appreciate this flip on thrill seeking by making attention a different kind of risk, and you're making yourself available to be changed by what you see, and it's not passive, it's actually quite challenging. And when I was younger and maybe more interested in, a bucket list of experiences and travels that I wanted to take, I talked to this older friend who had one of the best perspectives on parenthood. And he said having a child was the equivalent of climbing Everest for him, or any other kind of big traditional adventure, if not bigger, because it is an adventure. It is awe-inspiring if you think about it. And that simple observation, it just really changed my notions of parenthood and adventure. That parenthood is its own type of daily adventure, and that it inspires awe in a way that the things, same way as we classify other adventures. And so I guess that's what Caroline is getting at in perhaps a slightly different way, that love holds all of the characteristics of, extreme adventure as well.
Yeah, and I think that that's the risk that love asks of us, more than anything else. It's not the grand gesture; it's that sustained attention. I certainly feel that, the willingness to stay, to keep looking, and that's why it's so hard. You can train for a gyrocopter, you can learn the checklist, but love doesn't have one of those. And I think it's interesting that her title works as a question without a question mark. Why fly? Which she's going to get to in the interview. I love that. Period. Why fly? It's somewhere between a question and a declaration. Maybe it's a meditation. And as with so many good memoirs, Grant, it doesn't resolve, but rather illuminates.
Yeah, my kind of memoir. I'm always ready for illumination, especially about love. And as for flying, I'll have to live vicariously through Caroline. I even asked her if she'd take me up in a gyrocopter, and she said no. So
Hard no.
I'm excited to hear from her after this wonderfully short break. Hey, welcome back, everybody. I am thrilled to introduce Caroline Paul because she's a friend of mine. And if I remember right, Caroline and I met soon after the pandemic, and we talked about our mutual love of animal online videos. Caroline is a best-selling author, adventurous adventurer, and one of the first women to join the San Francisco Fire Department. She's known for nonfiction and memoirs highlighting risk-taking and outdoor adventures such as Fighting Fire, The Gutsy Girl, Tough Broad, and now Why Fly. And if you need proof beyond that, consider this. The most remote place she's ever been is Siberia, where she saw an unidentified flying object that may or may not have been the Soviet military. The highest place she's been was a mountain bike in the Bolivian Alps back when mountain bikes were scarce and 15,000 feet didn't hurt as much as it would now. And the most isolated she's ever felt was in a blizzard on the mountain of Denali, where she had to stay in a tent and pee into a Gatorade bottle. So I've only done the latter, Caroline.
You've peed into a Gatorade bottle?
Of all those adventures, I have done that.
Huh?
Do you want to
Good.
know more? You don't.
Yeah.
Let's not start there. At least we'll end there.
Bad starting point, right? But welcome to this new adventure of being on our podcast. How about that? Well, I've got a starting question. I oftentimes like to talk with writers about their titles, and Why Fly is interesting to me because it doesn't have a question mark, but it's somewhere between a question and a declaration. And I remember reading John Krakauer's Into the Wild and Into Thin Air, and he was obsessed with a similar question. Why climb a mountain and risk death? Why go into the wild or into thin air when you don't have to? So can you tell us more about your title?
Yeah, it's basically, I'm answering that question throughout the book because people ask me that all the time. I ask myself that. I've had some close calls, and you have to ask yourself, why do you keep flying? And so the whole book is really, it's an argument for that. And actually the ARC, the Advanced Reader's Copy, by accident, they put a question mark on the title. I was like, no, this is a statement, and I'm backing it up the whole book.
Mm-hmm. But fly kind of has two different meanings in the book, right? The flying of romance, of love.
And the crash landing of love, actually. I wrote this book when I've been flying for a long time. I've been flying for 40 years and various aircraft. And I always liked it. I loved it, actually. But I wasn't obsessed with it until I was 58 and I started flying a gyrocopter, which is sort of, I describe it as sort of a praying mantis meets a go-kart. It looks like a tiny helicopter. And I became obsessed with flying. And so I wanted to write about flight. But I also realized that one of the reasons why I happened to suddenly be gripped by obsession, first, the aircraft was incredible, but also because it was a time of my life that was very difficult. My marriage was ending, and I was trying to process that that grief. And so if I was going to write about book about flight, I was going to have to also write about my relationship.
Makes sense. Well, we'll get more into that, but I also want to say that you've consistently used physical experience, firefighting, surfing, paragliding, and now, like you said, gyrocopters as a way of knowing. And one question underneath all of your books is, what does the body understand that the mind might not understand? And so this book opens with an engine dramatically cutting out, and you've said that it wasn't meant to scare readers, but I wonder if it's also a kind of initiation. Like, what did you want readers to feel in that opening moment?
Well, as a writer, I wanted them to be glued to the page. And so, starting with it, I mean, most books start with an emergency of some sort, and mine just happens to be an engine cutting out at 1,000 feet. But I think that we are biological creatures, and we do process our world through our biology, which in this moment was fear, exhilaration, uncertainty. And I think that's the best way to understand story.
I like how you got into your mindset in that moment. Like you had this crucial moment of whether to keep trying to turn the ignition to turn the motor back on or whether to glide into this somewhat dangerous mountainside. It was riveting.
Oh, good.
Definitely. You achieved that. Well, awe as practice is a theme of your work as well. And in Tough Broad and now Why Fly, awe is very central, not as a byproduct of adventure, but as an active goal of it, and it becomes almost a spiritual practice. And you connect awe to creativity and to aging well and to surviving grief. And after graduating from Stanford, you had this pivotal moment where you became a firefighter instead of following a more conventional path. So I'm curious about that need to find awe at the center of that. Are you constantly in search of that?
Well, I wish I had been when I was young, and maybe I was, but I certainly didn't know it. The reason I engaged in so many adventures and loved firefighting and going into fires and the other things I did, which was traveling the world, in sea kayaks or on whitewater rafts or with my paraglider is really because I was seeking adrenaline and I wanted to sort of test myself and possibly also just sort of prove my mettle in front of other people. You know, I was young and that's what we do. But as I got older, I realized I wasn't really seeking adrenaline. When I flew, I wasn't psyched when I hit really rough air like I used to be. And I started to realize actually in the writing of Tough Broad is I did not have a word for what I was looking for when I went out in the world and experienced it through these adventures. People called it risk taking. They called it adrenaline. And I would just they'd say, you're a daredevil. And I didn't feel like a daredevil. And it wasn't until I was actually writing that book that I realized that what I was searching for and experiencing in really deep, profound ways was this concept of awe. And it's because we have not thought of awe in terms of anything really more than religious experiences until fairly recently, where they've been doing studies on awe. And it turns out that awe is really good for us. It's good for us on a biological level. It lowers our inflammation. It lowers our blood pressure. And it also makes us feel more connected to people. And they've done studies on this, more compassion. And so when I put a word finally to this feeling when I was for instance, in my gyrocopter looking down on the world, that, oh, that's wonder, that's awe, it just clicked.
Is that the best way to describe awe, as an experience or a feeling? Like, can you describe it in words? Just like when you were saying, like, I realized what awe was, it made me think, like, how often we use words without truly knowing what they mean or thinking about it.
Yeah, the general definition that I found while researching it was that it's a mixture of wonder and fear, maybe a little dread, usually in the face of something that feels more powerful than us, more mysterious. That's why it's used in religious circles so much. But then they did a study where they asked people to go on what they called awe walks. And in order to induce awe, they asked people to look at the world with fresh, childlike eyes. So there's kind of, there's like a newness and innocence, this ability to let yourself be amazed, I think, is the best definition of awe.
Well, going back to adrenaline for a second, Caroline, across all your books, there's an argument that women are socialized away from physical risk and that this costs us something essential. And so I'm curious how your thoughts about this have evolved as you've aged. And do you see the world becoming a bit more encouraging for us in this regard because of the kinds of things that you do and that you write and put out into the world? I'm curious.
I hope so. No, I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, we want our books to have that impact. Yeah, I've always been very aware that as women, we pull back a lot. We make ourselves smaller. We don't want to try and fail. We want to be perfect. There's just a lot of things we were socialized to. Now, it used to be that this was important in order to protect ourselves, because the laws didn't protect us. We were subsumed by, basically, if we got married, we took on our husband's name. So being diminished and diminutive was helpful to us. But I don't think now that the world has changed in this country and the laws do protect us more, and we are striving to be bigger and explore, we don't need to do that anymore. So shedding that habit culturally and just in ourselves is really difficult. And my books are always asking that that we do this. But one way you can automatically do this, it feels like, is if we go outside, because it automatically asks things of you that are about like being brave and being self-confident and conscious about our own choices. And that's what I love about nature. And we don't have to be pretty because we're muddy and we're dirty and we're just trying to impress like the mountain we're about to climb, not another person.
Nice way to put it. I want to talk about the love part of the book. Your spouse was Wendy McNaughton, the celebrated illustrator, and you co-wrote at least a couple books together, I think. and your relationship was long and public and creative and collaborative. So its dissolution, carries a lot of weight in different ways, I imagine. And this is clearly the emotional core of the book. And you said you didn't want to write about your personal life, but that leaving it out would have felt inauthentic. Or I read that you said that. How did you find the line between what belonged on the page and what didn't? Especially with that initial resistance. And I know you didn't name her in the book as well.
I did not want to write about my relationship, but I knew that since it really corresponded with my growing obsession with flight, which kind of makes sense when you lose control on the ground, this idea that I could gain control of this little yellow helicopter looking thing and it could take me into the air and it would do what I said, hopefully, was really compelling. And so I knew I had to write about my relationship as well as why we should all fly, or why flying is important to our culture and who we are as the human spirit. But I didn't want to. And my first readers told me, like, you mentioned that your marriage is fraying as you become obsessed with this gyrocopter, and then we don't hear about your marriage for the next 100 pages. And I'm like, it's because it's not. And they're like, no, it is important. You're working out things by flying, and you need to talk about your marriage. And, I never mentioned Wendy's name in the book. And my twin sister thought, she's one of my first readers, she thought that was bloodless. She's like, why aren't you naming her? And I was like, but I feel like it was the right decision, because anybody can find out that Wendy and I were together for 15 years. I mean, you can find that out on the internet. I wanted to make the descent of our marriage as I ascended in flight to be archetypal, everybody could relate to, because flight, a lot of people can't relate to. But when you start to pair the descent of a marriage with flying and the way I was working out grief by getting a new perspective, people start to really relate. So Wendy is my wife, is just named as my wife. But I did it not because I wanted her to be diminished in any way. In fact, that relationship was so important, and it is a change relationship. We have we're family, and we still are. The book is dedicated to her. She read it before it came out, before it was sent to my editor, so that she could okay everything and see that I treated her and our relationship with respect. We only had one pretty minor disagreement. She said it didn't really end that way. I said that. You didn't say that, which is classic, couples argument. And I was like, I don't think so. I think I said that. And she was like, super generously as she is, she said, you know what, this is your story. If that's the way you remember it, then that's true. And it's fine. It's great as it is. She gave me the carte blanche. But she is writing a book, so she gets to get back at me whichever way she wants.
We've talked about that a little bit, this idea of couples writing books and then reading, or exes. I mean, whatever the case might be. So that is kind of interesting.
Dueling books. And, that is not this book. This book is not a revenge at all. This is talking about how just love changes.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you're actually kind of pointing immediately into my next question, because really the book's central metaphor is like descent of love, ascent of flight, which you just described. And it's elegant and painful at the same time. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, you started to talk about this already, and so maybe it's somewhat already answered, but I'm wondering if writing about that parallel did help you to understand your marriage differently, or was it just helpful in terms of giving grief a shape of a sort?
I don't write for therapy. I think some people do, and I think that's fine. But I was looking back mostly on the way flight had helped me, and I don't think I had fully understood the way I was displacing my confusion and the chaos onto this getting better at this new type of flying for me, which is flying a gyrocopter, until I wrote the book. So I think often books can, I think, shape and give more meaning to the events. But, and so for that, I'm grateful. I mean, I really saw only link I initially saw was that I had become obsessed with flying this thing, and it happened to be during the time when my marriage was really coming apart. And I knew that was inextricable, but I don't think I had understood the depth to which not was it just correlated, but how flying actually gave me perspective.
It's so interesting, and I love those comparisons that you made. Brooke and I talked a little bit about this earlier, but how that made it, the flying part, really universal. I think you hit that note of the universal in a memoir, which is sometimes hard to do. But on that note of adventuring, I think adventurers are portrayed as solo heroes so often, and I know you to be one of the most active and supportive literary citizens in the Bay Area, and you just truly show up for people, and as a result, I think people show up for you. And I don't think that's by any design, I think it's just obviously to me a core part of who you are. And I know that you're an active member of the San Francisco Writers Grotto, and that's kind of where you got your start as a writer. But your support goes beyond that. So can you tell us why you're so community minded and how a community has influenced you as a writer and adventurer and maybe even as a friend and lover?
So I had actually written one book before I joined the Grotto. I joined the Writers Grotto, which for those people who don't know, at the time was just 9 people who got together, pooled their money to pay for a space so that they could sort of pretend we were going to a 9 to 5 job, because being a writer was not just lonely, but it was unstructured. And it felt, especially if no one's waiting for your masterpiece, you wanted to get up and go to work like everyone else did. And I had written a book, but I didn't know any writers. I had written my memoir about being a firefighter. And when I joined the Writers Grotto, there's something magical about people in community with a similar goal who want to lift each other up. And that was the central tenet of the Grotto, is that we are here to support, because we all knew we could write at a kitchen table for no money, our own mortgage, or at a cafe for the price of a coffee. But instead, we chose to be in energetically the same space, as well as obviously logistically, we could stop by people's offices, hear what they were doing, share advice. And so, on this sort of very practical level, being in community like that as writers was important, but also on an energetic level, it was interesting because everybody there they were good, but they weren't, they weren't they weren't at the top of their game yet. But when we came together, and maybe this was just age, but I do think that it's also because of the fact that we were in community and some sort of magic happened. People started having bestsellers. People started being well known. We got a little bigger, more bestsellers, National Book Awards. Like, if you look at the Grotto and look at the awards that people get there, I think that statistically, I just believe that it doesn't quite track with, oh, that's just one person's career. It tracks much better with, oh, these people are together, and that's what's making people so successful. I feel like I owe my writing career to the Grotto, mostly because there was a moment in my career, 2 books in, where I couldn't sell a book for beans, and I'd wander the halls dazed, weeping a little, and people be like, keep writing. It's going to come. Don't worry. Maybe they were lying to me, but that kept me there. And then boom, I managed to publish a book with Wendy, Lost Cat. And then I haven't stopped publishing since. Without the Grotto, I surely would have quit. Surely.
Love that story. Where Brooke and I are both community minded writers, and we're always telling people that community is really at the heart of being a successful writer, successful selling books, but also just writing, like you said. So thank you so much for joining us, Caroline.
So great. Thanks. I really appreciate being here.
Yeah, congratulations, and great to be with you.
Thank you.
Well, Brooke, I'm going to start today's book trend with a warning for listeners. We're going to be talking about AI. So if you feel symptoms of fear, anxiety, hopelessness, or despair, please call 1-800-FREAKING-OUT-ABOUT AI and get the help you need. But seriously,
I'm
today,
calling right now.
Okay, yeah, call. I'm not sure if that's the right number of digits. I didn't check, actually. It's a joke for listeners. But seriously, today I just want to shine a positive light on this issue, at least somewhat positive. Not AI, but authors being advocates against being harmed by AI. And one of the best and most admirable author advocates fighting the good fight against AI's thievery, is a former guest on our podcast, Andrea Bartz. And Andrea not only led the charge on the famous lawsuit against Anthropic, is that how you pronounce it?
Anthropic.
Anthropic, thank you. But she just wrote a very interesting op-ed recently in the Times about a new issue she sees coming quickly toward us on the horizon. She writes, as generative artificial intelligence worms its way through the publishing industry, I'm bracing for a stomach-turning query. Did you actually write this? And she's riffing on the recent news that the novel Shy Girl was written to some degree by AI. And she says AI is getting so good that it's going to soon be a persistent question in readers' minds whether any novel, even one written by Andrea Bartz, is real. And I say real with quotes around it because it's tougher and tougher to know what real is. And that's kind of her point. But since I know you really took on the Shy Girl news, Brooke, so can you give us a recap of what happened with it?
Yeah, in a nutshell, Shy Girl was self-published last year, early 2025, and then because it was selling well and had great reviews, it got picked up by Hachette UK, which published it at the end of 2025, and then it was on track for US publication with Hachette US, of course, in April 2026. But when presented with evidence that the book was decidedly largely written by generative AI, Hachette canceled the book. And so there's a lot more to this. I mean, people can do a deep dive, but the thing that is important about it is that this is the first major case like this, especially from a big publisher. I mean, Hachette is one of the big five. I personally cannot imagine that this was the first book to be canceled due to AI concerns. I think it was just the most public and the most visible, but it certainly has created ripple waves through the publishing industry. Like it's been a big deal.
Yeah. Well, Shy Girl, one thing I thought was interesting about it, was that it shows readers are attuned to the patterns and style of AI. And Andrea makes the point that AI is getting better and better.
Mm-hmm.
So, she also makes the point that since AI is trained on writers' novels, then it's easy to see how her own writing might come across to some as AI generated. Like, so in other words, she says, in other words, I don't write like AI. AI writes like me because AI has been trained on her novels, So she actually even tested this with her own writing. She pasted a few paragraphs of her own prose into a free online detection tool, and it deemed the passage very likely AI generated, with 82% of the text exhibiting hallmarks of AI. So who knows?
It's so frustrating. Like, I have to say, I hate this part of the story,
Yeah.
because what is the point of AI detection tools? Like, sorry, everyone, we said this was like a positive AI story, but now I'm like, I hate it.
Only because Andrea is fighting the good fight. Otherwise, it's questionable.
Yeah. I actually saw that Andrea posted those exact findings on Substack about like loading her own content into the detection tool. And that was before she wrote the Times piece. And I commented and I was like, this is going to cause some fights. And the reason I said that is because, it's completely not okay for an editor or a publisher like me to accuse an author of their work being AI generated when it's not, due to the AI tools that are meant to detect the AI generated writing being wrong in the first place. Like, what a mess. And Andrea even wrote in her Times piece, God help us. And I'm totally on with that. It's just like, where are we? And then she also writes, if you remove the flesh and blood author from the equation or plant seeds of doubt in readers' minds about whether what they're consuming is authentically human, the reader-writer relationship falls apart. And I couldn't agree with that more.
Yeah, it's definitely true. And in fact, on that note, right before coming on today, a friend of mine, Becky Took, she's a writer, she's really smart, and she was featured in The Atlantic for raising questions about whether portions of a New York Times Modern Love column was AI slop. And that hasn't been proven in one way or another, as far as I know, but people, especially writers, are beginning to read like this, with that kind of AI detector of their own. And a friend of mine who's also a professor, she says that she can easily detect AI slop patterns in her student writing as well. And she's had to confront a couple students and, essentially get them to confess. And I used to love these very cute, sentimental animal videos online doing unlikely things, like a bear rescuing a baby raccoon from a flooded river and then and then someone told me they were AI generated, and now I don't enjoy, basically any reels about animals I see on the internet. I question them all because that seed of doubt has been planted in me, and I want the real thing, but I don't know how to tell if it's the real thing.
It's not sad. I mean, I think this is where it's really challenging because that's the whole point, right? Is like we're blurring the lines between what is real and what's not real. And one of the reasons I love memoir is because it's real. It's the
Hmm.
reason that I read in this genre. And so it's so true. I mean, I hate that for the animal videos because that's like one of the things that brought you joy and now it doesn't anymore. It's so sad. And Andrea also speculates that it could fall on authors to prove the writing of their own work. Like, I don't exactly understand how that would work, not to mention how much effort it would be for editors and publishers to be like, prove to me, it's not like you can figure out an equation, like my 15-year-old has to like prove his math equation. So that
Hmm.
is just a challenging thought that is out there in the ether. But she does have this silver lining. So here's the positive part, everybody. Readers made it abundantly clear they want books by humans, not machines. This should hearten all the authors painstakingly getting words on the page one at a time and frighten those secretly using generative AI as a shortcut to a finished draft. I certainly hope that's true.
Yeah, and I think with writers, I mean, I think writers in the end, we want to go through that pain to craft our soul on the page. There is something necessary about that as just
Masochists.
masochists, but also human beings, I'll say.
Yeah.
We want to tell our stories and we want to tell them our way, or I hope that's the case. So, we have to take our good news where we can find it. And it is nice to hear that readers want human writers, at least for now. Fortunately, we're focused on a genre that doesn't need artificial intelligence as much as others because memoir is all about human intelligence and human experience. So we're going to keep the focus on that. If you haven't signed up for Memoir Nation listeners, memoirnation.com, please do. We have a panoply of very real support, community resources, classes, and more. So please sign up. We've got a lot of very real things planned for the rest of the year. Notice I'm emphasizing real. So we'll see you here next week with a real writer talking about writing. Bye-bye.
Ciao, everybody.